Good day everyone, and welcome to another edition of Crapper with me, Tim Appleton, on my own today. I thought since the other guys weren't available, I'd do a monologue this week on something a bit different. Not doing a lump of prog this week. I thought I'd do some classic rock from a slightly different genre, namely Jailbreak by Thin Lizzy. I was recently watching an episode of Sea of Tranquility on YouTube, which is it's an album discussion show, which I'm sure most people who are interested in this stuff will know of. And they were doing the greatest UK bands of all time, and I think that they'd included U2 in it. And it had caused some controversy because people had written and said U2 is not from the UK. They're from Ireland. But the thing is that, which is not in the UK, of course, just in case anyone was unsure of that fact. And the presenter said what's actually happened here is that we decided to include them because we weren't planning on doing a best Irish bands of all time ranking. So anyway, I started thinking about that, and I thought, if you did a ranking of the greatest Irish bands rather than the greatest UK bands, for instance, who would be on it, and more specifically, who would top it? Now, I think there's a lot of people would say U2. I wouldn't be one of those people, but they did a lot of. I'm sure they've done a lot of good stuff. U2. I think one of my favourite bands from the Republic of Ireland of all time is probably Thin Lizzy. I would give a special mention to Planxty, and I think between Planxty and Thin Lizzy, I think either of them could battle it out for the title spot. But, and I might do a Planxty album another day, by the way, because I love them immensely. But today I'm going to talk about Thin Lizzy, who I think you could make a case for being the greatest Irish rock, at least the greatest Irish rock band of all time. Key element of Thin Lizzy, of course, is Phil Lynott, the singer and songwriter. I believe he was actually English. He was born in the West Midlands, but he was raised in Dublin. He has an Irish accent. He considered himself an Irishman, and definitely has an Irish aesthetic, which is played out in his narrative focus, but above all, there's a sort of... the Irish are famed for being experts in like what the French theorist Jacques Lacan, who I'm a big fan of, would call linguistery, meaning, mysterious language. The greatest example of this of all time, of course, is James Joyce. But there's a sort of... tradition in Ireland of storytelling, popular and even song-orientated communication in sort of, like pubs and things like that. And Irish traditional music is extremely rich and an important part of their tradition. I suppose it's a subaltern thing, really, but maybe we'll come back to that later on. I was thinking that, and that's very much reflected in Phil Lynott, as I'm going to discuss today. I was thinking another way of thinking about Thin Lizzy, actually, is sort of a bit like Iron Maiden avant lettre. Right, that's to say Iron Maiden before they were Iron Maiden. Because if you're an Iron Maiden fan, as a lot of people are, me included, you sometimes wonder where on earth Iron Maiden got their inspiration from. And sometimes people say, well, it could have been, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple. But I don't necessarily see a direct line of continuity between those bands and Iron Maiden. And then you get sort of... because there's a lot of riffage in those three bands I just mentioned. And Iron Maiden do use riffs, but that's not the centre of what they do, arguably. And some people say, well, UFO could have been an influence. Maybe Wishbone Ash with the twin guitars, things like that, possibly Uriah Heep. But I don't necessarily see much of any of those bands either in Iron Maiden. And I think really, if you had to look for the most obvious precedent for Iron Maiden's music, I think it would be Thin Lizzy. That would be my argument. but we can have a disagreement about that another time if you like. Just thought I'd throw that out there. What I think about Thin Lizzy, great band, of course, as I've already made clear, I hope, from my perspective. I think that they have three key elements. This is going to be by the thesis that I shall be sustaining today. First one is hard rock, of course, hard rock band, which I think sort of comes from blues and indirectly jazz. And the second element, I think, is a sort of orchestral style band arrangements, with all the twin guitars and the way that they use the guitars for texture. I always think there's something orchestral about that. And then the third element, which really comes from Phil Lynott, I think, is as I say, the Celtic narrative structures and traditions, which, as I say, we'll come back to. Jailbreak is often considered their best album, so it's kind of obvious place to start. And I do think it is an absolutely wonderful album, one of the best rock albums ever made. As I say, I'll go through the details and explain that in more depth as I go through. It's a sort of a culminating album, because in the few albums before it, I think there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 albums before it. I think it's their 6th album. I should have checked that, really, before starting this. But yeah, I think it's their 6th album. And the albums before it are a kind of a mishmash of different styles. And they're obviously trying out different things. And then on Jailbreak, it all seems to sort of come together a bit. They seem to have sort of consolidated their style. They had done that slightly before on the previous album, Fighting. But the 4 albums before that are all kind of quite eclectic, ecumenical, you could say. And to give a nice sort of Christian Catholic reference. There's sort of folk elements, directly folk elements, but also some sort of funk stuff. I mean, they're trying all sorts of different things. But yeah, as I say, by Fighting, they seem to have got it pretty much together. The lineup seemed to be more or less consolidated for the first time, and it continued. That lineup continued into this album. We've got Phil Lynott on vocals. Let's see, Brian Robertson, Scott Gorham on guitars, and Brian Downey on drums. Amazing drummer. I'm not actually going to talk much about him today, but I think he's one of the best drummers in the history of rock, really. He's an astonishingly good drummer and quite sort of underrated, I would say. Always does a solid job on anything he's on. But yeah, so Jailbreak is a really amazing sort of culminating album. The albums they did after it, lots of good albums, lots of great songs. But I find them a little bit more, slightly more variable in terms of quality, the albums. But it depends. I think Chinatown I always thought was a very good record. And I quite like the last two, in their own way. But maybe we'll discuss that another day. But yeah, as I say, Jailbreak is probably a good place to start. Now, what about the cover? Because we conventionally discuss the cover on this channel, but I'm not an expert in plastic arts, as I've always made clear. It's all right, this cover, isn't it? It's all right. It's grey. Actually, it's drawn by apparently a drinking buddy of Phil Lynott's, Jim Fitzpatrick. This is somebody met in the pub, I think. And they were obviously very close throughout their whole lives from that point onwards. He gave him the gig of doing their album covers from then on. I think I don't know if he did all of them, but certainly did quite a few. I think that they are. He's obviously a painter, and there's an influence of. I should say that there's an influence. I mean, I don't know whether. You either like painted covers or you don't, I think, in rock music. I mean, certainly being paintings, they were a big influence on bands like Iron Maiden and all of the Nwobum, great initialism, that Nwobum bands. But I often think paintings are a slightly redundant thing to be doing by this point in the history of art. But I think they work well enough. And of course, painting is technically very difficult. So, I mean, I suppose that has to be, you have to take that into account when you're evaluating, a cover like this one. There seems to be a sci-fi influence, particularly on this cover, because it's got this sort of figure who's like an alien type figure watching a TV screen, and then the band are drawn in colour in the middle of this silver image. They're drawn in colour in the TV screen, escaping from something, as sort of band of brothers, we happy few. That's a theme that comes up quite a lot on the album. But they're painted in a sort of comic style, and I think Marvel Comics was a sort of obsession for Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Linnett as well. They obviously kind of like dialogued, as they say, about how to do these covers. And so I suppose you could say that they're sort of fairly close to what the band would have actually wanted, or at least Phil Lynott, So, that probably makes them more kind of like personal to the band and the project. Now let's go to tracks. Without further ado, side 1 begins with Jailbreak. Now this is a brilliant opener. How could it not be? It's crashing straight in, and they really want to make a statement here, I think. It's rivetingly atmospheric, I would say. It's got sound effects in the middle as well, which is kind of like part of the atmosphere. It reminds me slightly of Jailbreak by AC/DC, which is another sort of narrative song like this one is. Because I think that, AC/DC were Australian, but, Australia is also sort of populated by people from the regions of the British Isles, the peripheries of the British Isles. And I think, like, the Young Brothers in AC/DC were actually from Scotland originally. Scotland and Ireland to some extent share a culture. Might come back to that as well later on, we'll see. Now, Jailbreak is in F, but the licks seem to be sort of F-sharp licks. So they've obviously tuned down a semitone, which kind of adds gravity to the whole effect. I think the tightness of the opening riff, they come in with a sort of crash. Down, they just hit the tonic. And then they come in dun 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 dun. Now, the tightness of that opening riff, I think, definitely foreshadows certainly new wave of British heavy metal stuff. And maybe even, I don't know, like sort of thrash metal a little bit. I mean, I can almost imagine Metallica doing this, because the guitar playing is automatically very tight. So it's like it almost sounds like and this is only 1976, remember, so it's almost like they're creating a new style here, a sort of formal, disciplined rhythm guitar style. It's not a riff, as I said before, a la Black Sabbath, because it's more like a bed for the song, which is an important complication. But I think it's certainly very tight. That's what I wanted to say about it, really. Now, the thing is, I think the tightness relies on it being in 4/4. And this is a particular complication that I wanted to point out. I mentioned before that they were influenced by blues and indirectly jazz. And I think the jazz element here is important. For two reasons. First of all, on this album in general, I should say. First of all, because it's got a sort of, a lot of this music has a swing, which is I think it's kind of a jazz thing. That sort of continual syncopation, which you get with a swing, like as in a compound time rather than a simple time. I think the thing here is that I think that this track, the tightness of the riff, the guitar riffs, indicates that it's in simple time. But actually, I think that it should be in compound time. This is a really very, very weird argument to make. But the thing is, it's too fast to do it in compound time, because there's no way you could play compound time that fast. And so almost by default, it's become simple time, and that's where the tightness of the guitar riffs comes from. But actually, there's a sort of buried swing time in there, I think. And again, I'll mention that more on the next Dragon stuff. But the second jazzy element I wanted to mention was the guitar chords. But I will come back to that later because that's not really present on the jazz guitar chords element is not actually present on this particular track. Again, we have a sort of battery of guitars here, almost orchestral, I would say. Like, for example, on the chorus, where the guitar goes up very high, plays a high F, E flat, over the, what would it be, A sharp, E flat chords, which is kind of a clash, actually, a harmonic clash. But they're already doing textural work by the time they got to the chorus of this first track. I think that's what I wanted to point out. We do need to talk about the words here, because as I sort of insinuated before, the words in Thin Lizzy are unusually important for a rock band. And I think this is, as I said, the Celtic part. There's a sort of, as I say, storytelling, folklore, and ultimately sort of dramatic and aesthetic use of words in the Irish narrative tradition. Who knows why, but as I say, it could be part of being a subaltern culture. It could be like transmitting ideas through the voice and through, being a raconteur. I think that's the word. It could be to do with a lack of literacy due to impoverishment, which was a condition that most people in most parts of the world suffered in the past. But particularly a problem in, impoverished areas, as it was then the British Isles or whatever. And I think it's also partly political, because it's to do this way of like speaking to each other and transmitting via narrative and through the voice ideas to each other is a sort of, could be a subversive thing. And this has something to do, of course, with their historical relationship with the English, which wasn't particularly happy. Let's not get into that here too much. But yeah, I think the upshot of this is that I think Phil Lynott is a sort of Irish storyteller in the classical sense. He's very good with words, wants to communicate something. I was thinking that, perhaps the greatest example of this is, as I said, James Joyce, and perhaps his greatest work is perhaps Ulysses. It's sort of the greatest work of Irish fiction of all time, possibly. Then maybe Jailbreak is the Ulysses of hard rock, we could say. Plus, of course, Phil Lynott is obviously literarily informed. There's references to Shakespeare in this album, so on and so forth. So he's obviously a reader, himself. Now, and this track is an example of this, right? This is what I was hoping to get to. It's about a jailbreak, in case that wasn't obvious. Tonight there's going to be a jailbreak somewhere in this town. But presumably in the jail. That's the old joke. So if you like, this is a sort of ripping yarn. But I think what's great about this, and I think this is the interesting narrative twist, because narrative is often about voices, right? It's actually sung in the voice of the lead jailbreaker, right? But the language is all pretty threatening, right? So then the question becomes, why would the lead threatener, as it were, be being self-consciously threatening? Is it because he's angry? Well, yes, of course, because he's in prison. But he also knows he's a bad guy. This seems to be the crux of the matter. Me and the boys. So he's sort of reveling in his own egregiousness, as it were. And so that could be seen as weird until you realise that actually, of course, it's not him speaking. It's actually the voice of the imagination of the people in the town that are about to be attacked. So it's a play of mirrors. This is the fantasy that the people in the town have about what the lead jailbreaker would say to himself, I think, which I think is a really clever twist. And it also gives a special piquancy to the elliptical line. Hey, good-looking female, come here. And that's it. That's a nice example of Phil Lynott cutting and editing the lines and, prioritizing, as I said, dramatis personae over tune necessarily. Although the tunes are also great here. That was something me and Peter discussed in our video about Simon and Garfunkel and the way Paul Simon writes lyrics. Okay, track 2, side 1, Angel from the Coast. Another great track, really great, atmospheric. Really skips along, this one. And this time it is a full swing rhythm. So it's very jazzy. But again, it's slightly slower than the opening track, Jailbreak, which allows them to properly swing it in a way that they couldn't with the first track. So it's got, I think that's the opening drum fill, played incredibly fast by Brian Downey. He obviously realizes intuitively that he can actually swing this one, right? Which is great. I mean, that shows how musical his drumming is. I also think it's kind of like, in that sense, it's a sort of a completion of the unrealized rhythm on the first track. So sort of unconsciously, it creates a musical connection between the first and the second tracks, almost as if they were a medley, an unconscious medley, if you like. Again, opens with a very interesting riff, presumably played on a Les Paul, which seemed to be their Gibson Les Paul, which seemed to be their axe of choice in this band. It has a sort of very characteristic sound, the Gibson. But this riff, which is kind of, as I say, again, the sort of bed for the track, as well as being kind of fun and interesting in its own right, and very, very skippy, as I said, very swingy. But this frees up the other guitar to do something totally different. A sort of attacking home note, like a tonic note, which is quite sort of unexpected. And so immediately on this track, you see Brian Robertson and Scott Gorham sort of widening and broadening the sound. Right. So this is where, as I said, the orchestral dimension comes in. And we also, of course, here get for the first time the balance, quite evident balance between the guitar orchestra and the kind of lyrical Celtic songwriting from Phil Lynott. So you've got the guitarist on one side and Phil Lynott on the other. It's also the first track, along the same lines as the first track, to contain the twin guitars close harmonised in thirds. That's a very Iron Maiden. That was sort of transferred directly into the Iron Maiden sound, right? They just sound like Iron Maiden when they're playing like that, But again, before, avant, lettre. And again, it's a short track, this one, but the guitar section it's got a guitar section in the middle, which, as I say, is again kind of quasi-orchestral. It's like a little suite, and it moves through a series of feels and textures. You got sort of twin guitars, and you've got a funky riff, which is a sort of variation of the main riff, short lead solo, series of full strum chords, qua apotheosis of this mini suite, and then a short reprise of the funky variation riff, and then back to the song. So, as I say, it's sweet-like, but delightfully succinct. Now, onto the lyrics. This is a song about gambling, which reflects, again, another side of the Irish experience, what the French would call plus de jouir. When you don't have access to wealth and happiness, so you use other techniques to fill in the gaps, like drugs, drink, tobacco, gambling, etc. There's a sort of reference to, I suppose, what you say, like crapulousness and a life on the edge, which is also present in Ulysses by James Joyce, of course. And once again, is an effect of, historical poverty or desperation or whatever it is. And it's an important aspect of Phil Lynott's life as well, because he was famously, addicted to drugs, so on and so forth. Final sort of Irish thing here is that there's a self-consciously Catholic reference in this track. The Sacred Heart is bleeding, go tell the Holy Ghost. Right. That must have been conscious. Culturally conscious on Phil's part. I assume he's writing all the lyrics here. Most of the songs are written in his name, but some of the other band members contribute to certain songs, but I'm guessing that they're contributing musical arrangements alone, because, and maybe riffs and things, because the words are so personal to Phil Lynott, one assumes. But again, yeah, this song seems to be a sort of short narration. It reminds me slightly of Lily, Rosemary and the Jack of Hearts by Dylan off Blood on the Tracks, which I presume Phil Lynott must have known. There's no way Lynott wasn't a Dylan fan. Because this whole way of writing rock lyrics was basically invented by Dylan. Metaphorical, literary, narrative focused, and I guess Van Morrison could have also been an influence. Must have been an influence. I would think he's also from the island of Ireland. I think he's from the north, isn't he? But anyway, okay, good. Track 3, side 1. Running Back. Now, this is a lovely song, in my opinion. Hard rock fans might not like this one so much. It was supposed to be a hit single. It was recorded as a hit single, I think, but I don't think they released it as a hit single. But they've added some instruments here because it's obviously supposed to get radio play. So they've got an electric piano in it this time and saxophone, which I suppose are obligatory instruments for a hit single, apparently. But the band weren't happy with this sort of arrangement. I think they wanted to do it all on guitars, the other members of the band, at least. And I think they blamed the producer for this, who was, hang on, let me check it. The producer was John Alcock. Yeah. I neglected to mention that this was produced by John Alcock, and released in 1976. It was recorded in Ramport Studios in London, which was the studio built by the Who, I think. But yeah, so there was some tension here between the producer and the band, I think. This time it's a proper swing, full-on swing, because it's a fast 6/8 time signature. This proves my thesis, verifies my hypothesis that there's a strong jazzy element here. In this band, but yeah, this track is a sort of, as you might expect from hit singles, a sort of classic love song, really, and it's got a nice use of the major third in the vocal against the fourth chord, in the accompaniment. That's in the chorus. I'll be running back to you again. Da, da, da. That's always a nice, that suspension is always nice. And they play it very nicely here, I think. I suppose it's, that's a sort of suspension which is frequently present in Celtic folk music as well. And I suppose it's supposed to sound plaintive, because this is a Torch song, right? And it also contains a nice meta moment where he says, I make my money, like a postmodern moment where he says, I make my money singing songs about you. Is my claim to fame. Which I think is nice, because it does have programmatic significance apart from being just simply postmodern, because it reflects the difference between the pain, which he references in the song because he's lost his best girlie, and the way that one experiences that subjectively, which is therapeutically quite profound, But yeah, therapy culture goes along with postmodernism to some extent, I suppose. But we don't need to talk about that here because we're discussing Thin Lizzy. Okay, good. Now, track 4, Romeo and the Lonely Girl. Another classic. I mean, we've got a run of 4 exquisite tracks so far. So this album is already off to a rollicking start. I even think this track actually forms a bit of an arch with Angel from the Coast. So there seems to be some sort of continuity between these 4 tracks, programmatically, in terms of the album programming. Because it's another very fast swing, this one. And it is played as a swing again, this one, unlike the opening track. And again, the lyrics, like in Angel from the Coast, are sort of storyteller-ish. And again, like Angel from the Coast, this is indicated in the title, Romeo and the Lonely Girl, right? The narrative dimension here is completely up front. I'll come back to that in a second. Before we do that, I just wanted to show what I meant about the jazz guitar chords, which I've been heavily trailing. The diversity in the guitar arrangements is apart from the jazzy stuff, the diversity is evident here, because this is like a swung funk line, a rhythm guitar line. And I think the jazz element in the chords is very present here, because this is they use minor sevenths, which is a very jazzy thing. The seventh chords are a sort of jazz thing, right? Because because you need to have a certain acoustic, because they're subtle, but you also need a certain acoustic setup to hear those in the context of a hard rock band. So they're obviously taking all that into account when they are producing it and organising the sound. When they're producing the sound in general, either live or on record. So let's imagine it's in E. I can't remember what key it's in, but I think that's a minor seventh, because the without the seventh it would be. But this is. Slightly more rocky at the end, but I think those, as I say, that seventh effect is quite jazzy. There's also going back to the lyrics. I think there's a couple of classical references here, of course, and this is where the sort of the classically narrative aspect comes in. The title is a reference to Shakespeare, of course, Romeo and Juliet, but it actually seems to be a joke here. It's referenced jokingly, I think, because the title, of course, is asymmetrical, because Romeo and Juliet it should be, and then with that you get the boy and the girl, right? And the relationship between the two of them is central to the Shakespeare play, right? But they both need to be present in order for the tragedy to play out. We need Peter's help on this, really, because he's the Shakespeare guy. But what you've got here in the Thin Lizzy version is Romeo and someone else. Romeo and the Lonely Girl. So Romeo and X. So it's almost like algebraic. So that symmetry is removed. So you've got Romeo, but now Juliet, let's say. So Romeo here becomes something of a narcissist, right? But in that sense, he's a tragic figure, but in a different sense to the Shakespeare sense, right? And that's why he says, chorus is poor Romeo sitting out on his ownio, which seems like an awkward rhyme, but I think it's funny because it kind of plays with the asymmetry in the title, right? It kind of reflects that. And it also underlines the stupidity of this guy's subjective position, right? Because basically he's a Don Juan figure, right? Who's supposed to be an expert in seducing women. But of course, what this means is that no woman is enough for him. And of course, therapeutically, Freud would say that means he's unconsciously gay, of course. But I think the thing is that here, there's another literary reference here. I think that's what I wanted to really point out. So you've got not just Shakespeare, but Tirso de Molina, who's a Spanish playwright. I live in Spain, of course, so Tirso de Molina Plaza is just up the road. He invented the character of Don Juan, I believe. I don't think it's based on a classical character. But anyway, yeah. So there's a nice set of references there, tragic references, because I think Don Juan's end was tragic, as was Romeo's, as was Juliet's. Okay. Side 1, track 5 is Warriors. Now, I said we had a run of 4 perfect tracks. This is the first track that I don't like that much on this album. doesn't really matter because it's like the end of the side, so you just sit through it, flick the side over, or just play it through if you're on the CD or streaming or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that not only is this the first track I think doesn't work particularly well, but it's a different kind of track as well, and I think that might be why it doesn't work as well. It's the first medley-ish Thin Lizzy track on the album. The previous ones are like 4 sort of hit singles in a row, very succinct and successful hit singles as well. And this track is almost like a track just for the band, and that's why I think it works less well. They're obviously happy with it, but I'm not really sure whether it's audience-facing, you could say, this track. It's got a riffy guitar introduction. And, I mean, really, it's almost like an instrumental guitar piece, this one. And it has got a song sort of stuck in the middle of it. But I think the song part is less interesting. It's more just like a lyrical fragment, like a short poem. But it doesn't have much melodic interest. So it's just its intention seems to be to just give colour and context to the guitar developments in the track, which I think are, as I say, less interesting. I think this is less... They said that... So I read someone saying that Phil Lynott had written the opening riff, but the thing is, I think this is less a Phil Lynott track and more a Thin Lizzy track, and I think as such, it works less well. No offence to the other members of Thin Lizzy, who are great in their way, but I mean, play to your strengths. God. The lyrics, for their part, seem to challenge Norse mythology, which might echo the mythological dimension of Celtic or Gaelic culture, I suppose. That might have been intentional by Phil. But I think he's also making a sort of bit of a joke, or a dark joke here, because the warriors that he references in the title, they're not really soldiers. Actually, they're supposed to be, according to what I've read, cultural experimenters, specifically drug addicts, right? So it's about how drug addicts sort of laugh in the face of death, as it were. They're the warriors of our time, which is sad, of course, because Phil Lynott died from septicemia, I think it was, which was a side effect of something to do with his drug use, And don't know whether... I've never been a drug addict, so I don't know quite how the psychological mechanism works. But I don't know whether drug addicts sometimes take an obscure sort of satisfaction from the tragedy of their condition. It might be possible. And Phil Lynott seems to be playing with that ambivalence in this song. I also don't appreciate the out-of-tune choral vocals towards the end. I think that was a bit unnecessary to include some out-of-tune vocals. So I think basically this is Phil being a bad boy and the vocals are out of tune. So I think this is a skipper, this track. But anyway, as I say, it doesn't last long. You don't have to wait long for something good to come along with this album. Something good to start playing. Side 2 then, Boys Are Back in Town. Now what can you say about this track? This is a masterpiece and their most famous song. Rightly, I think. Because I think that I've talked about another Catholic reference, the Holy Trinity of elements, right? Well, I think the marriage between them, the jazz thing, the Celtic thing, and the orchestral guitar parts, quasi-orchestral guitar parts. I think the marriage between them is never more successful than it is on this track, right? I think, first of all, this is probably their most jazzy hard rock song. I mean, again, you've got the minor seventh jazzy guitar chords. They get all the resonance out of them that they can here. Plus you get, of course, the compound time, the out and out swing on this one, 6/8. So there's no holding back on the jazz references here. And I mean, you've got the guitar orchestra dimension and most famously the twin guitar post-chorus section on this track. And it's epic, that, because it's actually a part of the line, which isn't necessarily the case on some of the other tracks. So it's actually part of the compositional structure rather than just an ornament. And I think that's great here. Plus, of course, Phil Lynnett's narrative gift is never better than it is on this this track, you know. You know, what about these lyrics? Well, first of all, you got the evocative character of the title. Boys are back in town. A slight echo of Jailbreak. Again, I sometimes think the best albums are like concept albums, but not actually necessarily concept albums. And this is one of them. In this track, you get an lyrical echo of Jailbreak. You know, are these the prisoners back in the urban spaces, you know, after their incarceration? And then the way that the other scenes are derived from this motif is very literary, I think. They're oblique, but they're quite striking. And again, you get this sort of Freudian homoerotic dimension, you know, this pure enjoyment and the productivity of masculine relations in themselves, which women are sort of involved with, but only in the secondary sense. You know, the brothers are coming together, enjoying being together, they're competing, they're fighting, probably partly over girls. But actually this fighting kind of unites them even more. There's a great line in it where Phil Lynott sings, "That chick don't want to know, forget her." You know, and I think that sums up the song, that line. I think it's such a beautiful moment. And then again, you know, as I said, you have the emotional depth of those accompanying jazzy guitar chords, and you know the almost wordless narration of the twin guitar passages. It almost makes me think that they're like the Greek chorus, you know, in the Attic tragedies. These twin guitars, and then again, finally, it's unusually sweet, like an orchestral. The arrangement for a hit single, and I think it was a hit single. I presume it was. Don't know what number it got to in the charts. And they even add a third guitar part right at the end. You know, so at the fifth. You know, we got one at the third and one at the fifth, I think. I haven't checked it. Should have done. Haven't. Let's carry on. And that sort of seems, but that seems to sort of enhance the communal dimension, you know, the choral dimension. So it's quite beautiful, this track. Very potent combination of all the things that made the band great, I think. It's followed on side 2 by Fight or Fall, which is a ballad, much softer. It's the only sort of soft track on the album, really. It's a beautiful song, I think. Probably necessary at this point in the record. Thin Lizzy would often do like a long series of hard rock tracks and then throw a ballad in somewhere at a key sort of dramatic point in the album. Again, this one has subtle sort of jazzy chords. Some sevenths in there, I think, once again. And again, it's a swing track, but obviously it's fast, so it can't actually be properly swung, so it's played in half time again, and the swing is sort of implicit, a bit like the opening track. But I think there's definitely, an implicit swing in here. Again, is this part of a concept? You know, is this part of a sort of concept that is present at other points on the album? Because Fight or Fall seems to be a reference to, again, sort of boisterous masculine relations. And the song is addressed to what he calls the brothers. This could also be, I suppose, a political dimension again, something to do with Irish politics. Brothers fight or fall, he says. Got it written here. It's man for man and one for all. No more can we crawl. And then there's a screened last line where he says, we got to fight for one another, right? Which sounds very political. But I suppose that raises the question of whether the masculine relations which are referenced in the other tracks are actually more political than we had previously guessed. There is also possible Christian reference here, the Christian brothers, which were... Obviously, you have the affiliation between the disciples in Christ, but I mean, that's not directly referenced here, but the Christian Brothers were a notable set of schools, I believe, based in Ireland, you know, and I think they were officially supportive of Catholic schools, you know, and I think they were supportive of Irish republicanism. That could be a factor here. Who knows? Who cares? Okay, track 3, side 2 is Cowboy Song. I think this is perhaps the last sort of epically great song on the album. These first 3 tracks on side 2 I think are awesome. This time it's a full-on medley. almost like a musical. It starts with a quiet, slow introduction, which seems to be like it's supposed to portray a campfire scene, and then the band picks up and starts to kick in. Again, the words are a story, plenty of narrative detail, but also, again, some ellipses this time. I mentioned the ellipses before. This is some ellipses, there's some gaps, almost as if you're supposed to fill in the details yourself. The listener is invited to fill in the details themselves. It seems to be a tale of a cowboy travelling around with no home because he's looking for a girl, basically. A simple story, but of course it's allegorical because it has nothing to do with being a cowboy, really. It's more universal than that. But I do think that, the sort of obliqueness of the lyrics, as I say, leaves something to the imagination, and it's not clear quite how you're supposed to take these lyrics, and I think that's kind of always interesting. And again, this time the guitar solo seems to have a structural function because it seems to sort of advance the story. Following the guitar solo seems to be a comment on the story itself, which is part of the obliqueness, and it's followed by solo is followed by the usual twin guitar cascades, which almost seem to evoke a waterfall. At least that's how I think about it. We're out on the prairie, remember. And then you get muted guitar chords followed by a final solo, which is again equally sort of evocative. It seems like they're painting a picture with the guitars here, of the prairie. That's what I'm trying to get at. But I think, basically, this is just, for me, this works well because it's a great tune, and harmonically, again, reminiscent of great sort of Celtic songs. Ironic that it's set in America, then perhaps, but then America is never more than one imaginative leap away for the Irish, for famous and tragic historical reasons, which they actually did a song about Thin Lizzy directly on the next album, on the follow-up album, Fool's Gold, about Irish people leaving Ireland to go to America during the famine. Now, track 4, final track on the album. This is another song I don't like too much. Sides 1 and 2 have the same structure in this sense. Each of them closes with a track which I find less interesting. But I mean, maybe that's not so important. I don't know. Thin Lizzy fans seem to love this track, but it doesn't do much for me. It's another song about men hanging out and fighting. Remember that the previous album was called Fighting. But this time it's about a mythical sort of Celtic battle. It almost sounds like a Scottish theme, although of course there's a strong historical connection between Scotland and Ireland. Which again, we don't have to go into here. Perhaps this is the most Iron Maiden-ish type lyric, I think. Because Iron Maiden wrote songs about battles quite frequently. And the music also sounds Iron Maiden-ish to me on this track, although perhaps, not as good on this occasion. But yeah, this reminds me of Warriors, also structurally, because the words are a sort of fragment cast in the middle of what is essentially a guitar piece. And as I say, when you lose that interaction, you're losing a key element of Thin Lizzy's music. That's really why I think it doesn't work as well. Perhaps I should mention, on the subject of the old orchestral arrangements again, the track ends with an actual guitar battle between Robertson and Gorham, which is a fun idea. That's what you call program music. You don't notice it, at first glance, but if you think about it, listen to it a lot and think about it a lot, you realise that they're reflecting the battle, of the lyrics in the music itself, the structure of the music itself. But yeah, as I say, I think this is a slightly less interesting track overall, which makes me wonder why they put it last. I mean, wouldn't it have been better to close on something a bit less downbeat? Something a bit more hitty? I mean, I think Cowboy Song would have been a lovely closer. Unless, in the case of Warriors and Emerald, those two tracks are being deliberately relegated to the end of the side, which is possible, so that encourage people to keep listening to the album. Could have been part of their calculations, I don't know. I mean, how do you program an album? It's a very interesting question, isn't it? A question which we may come back to another time. Well, in conclusion, this is an absolutely great album, I think. And I love it so much, I just wanted to chat about it a bit. I think it's basically one killer track after another, almost throughout. Probably their best, but they also did loads of other amazing stuff, as I've pointed out. But this is definitely one to start with if you want to, just dip your toe in the water. Before Phil Lynott and his boys emerge from the spume to cut it off. To cut your toe off in a scene worthy of Celtic myth. Okay, on that note, I'll leave it. Please, if you're listening on the podcast, don't forget to give us a ranking and leave us a comment if you can. We would very much appreciate hearing from you. And same applies to the YouTube version as well. And thank you very much for listening. I'll see you on the next episode. It should be next week. Okay. Ta-ra for now.